Grief does not announce itself loudly. It settles into a house like dust. Quiet, constant, impossible to sweep away completely. Some men bury their wives and, in time, find a way to keep living. Others bury a wife and quietly stop living in the same house as their own future. Thomas Calloway was the second kind of man, and nobody in Cedar Hollow, Wyoming, believed that would ever change. Not the neighbors, not the preacher, not even Thomas himself. It would be nearly a month before a woman arrived at his door and changed the shape of that house forever, before he finally whispered into the dark of March evening 5 words he had not said aloud to another living soul. "I buried my wife last spring." And before she answered, without hesitation, in a voice steadier than she felt, "Then let me be your family now." That moment was still weeks away. First, there was a house that had stopped breathing, and a woman about to walk into it. The Calloway Ranch sat 2 miles outside Cedar Hollow, Wyoming, at the base of a ridge the locals called Widow's Rise. Nobody remembered anymore whether the name came before Thomas's wife died, or after. By the spring of 1889, it hardly mattered. The name fit either way. The land was never neglected. Fences mended on schedule. The herd healthy. Hay stacked high enough to survive a hard winter twice over. That was the strange part. Men who lose themselves to grief usually lose their property along with it. Fields go untended. Fences sag. Not here. The barn was swept. The tools hung in careful rows. It was... Thomas had come to understand without ever saying so. The only place grief seemed to leave him alone. The house was different. A rocking chair sat by the hearth, angled slightly toward the window, exactly where it had always been. Nobody used it. Nobody moved it either. A woman's shawl still hung on a peg by the door, faded now from a year of dust and sun, untouched since the day she'd last worn it. A little girl's blue dress hung in the closet with a hem that had needed mending since October. Nobody had touched that either, because fixing it would have meant admitting she'd grown. And admitting she'd grown would have meant admitting time was still moving, even without her. Thomas Calloway was 36 years old, broad-shouldered, weathered, the kind of quiet that unsettled people who didn't know him and comforted the few who did. He rarely looked anyone directly in the eye anymore, not out of unkindness, but out of habit. Eyes, he had learned, asked questions a man wasn't always ready to answer. He spoke in short sentences. Fine. Later. Don't know. Whole conversations reduced to single words, often like coins he couldn't spare. His children rarely heard him laugh anymore. They barely heard him at all, except at supper, when he asked if the chores were done, and again at bedtime, when he told them to blow out the lamp. Everything else lived inside him, locked, untouched, like the rocking chair by the window. Eleanor Hayes arrived in Cedar Hollow on the first Tuesday of March, carrying a single carpet bag and a letter of introduction from a cousin she barely remembered writing to. She was 26, unmarried, alone in a way that had nothing to do with being unaccompanied on a stagecoach, and everything to do with the 2 years behind her that she rarely spoke of. There had been a wedding planned once, a church reserved, a dress half-sewn, and then, quietly, without a scene, without a scandal, the man had simply stopped writing. No explanation ever arrived. Eleanor had waited 3 months for a letter that never came before she finally understood that some silences are their own kind of answer. She kept one thing from that chapter of her life, a small gold locket, the clasp slightly bent, holding no photograph at all, only a curl of hair from a mother who had died when Eleanor was 12. She touched it sometimes without realizing she was doing it. A small, private habit. The way some people touch a scar to make certain it's still there. A housekeeper was needed at the Calloway Ranch. Room, board, and modest wages. In exchange for cooking, mending, and looking after 2 children whose mother had passed the previous spring. The advertisement had been 3 lines long. It had not mentioned grief. It had not needed to. The wagon driver set her bag down without ceremony. "Calloway don't talk much," he offered, almost as an apology, climbing back onto his seat. Good help never needs him to. Then he was gone, and Eleanor stood alone in the yard, studying the house the way a person studies a stranger they've been told very little about. The porch sagged slightly at one corner, not from neglect, but from use, a board worn soft by years of boots, never replaced because replacing it would have meant noticing it first. A child's rope swing hung from the oak beside the house, one side higher than the other, as though nobody had adjusted the knot in a very long time. The garden beside the porch had clearly once been tended with care. Neat rows, a low fence to keep out rabbits. Now it was choked with weeds, the fence leaning, one gate post rotted through at the base. Eleanor noted all of it, quietly, not with judgment, with information. Because a house tells you who lives in it, whether or not the people inside mean to let it. The door opened before she reached the steps. A man stood in the frame, tall, broad through the shoulders, a day's stubble along the jaw set somewhere between exhaustion and resolve. He did not smile. He did not extend a hand. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at a decision he isn't certain he's made correctly yet. "Miss Hayes." "Mr. Calloway." A pause stretched between them, the kind that exists only when two strangers are deciding how much silence they can tolerate before it becomes rude. "Children are inside," he said finally, and turned back into the house, leaving her to follow or not, as she chose. Eleanor picked up her bag and followed. The first thing she noticed inside was a quiet, not peaceful quiet, the other kind, the kind that has to be maintained, like a held breath. A boy of about 10 sat at the table, carving something small out of a scrap of wood, not looking up. A girl, younger, 6, perhaps 7, sat near the hearth, hugging her knees, watching a newcomer with a particular wariness of a child who has already learned that people who arrive sometimes leave again. "This is Daniel," Thomas said, nodding toward the boy. "And Mary." Neither child spoke. Eleanor crouched slightly, meeting the girl's eyes at her own level rather than. Looming above her, "Hello, Mary." The girl studied her for a long moment, then looked away toward the empty rocking chair by the window and said nothing at all. Eleanor understood immediately. This was not a house that trusted easily, and she had not come here expecting it to. That first evening told her almost everything, though nobody spoke a word of explanation. Supper was simple. Beans, cornbread, a thin stew Thomas had clearly made from habit rather than intention. He ate standing at the counter, 3 bites, then set the bowl aside as though eating had become an obligation rather than a comfort. The children ate in silence, glancing occasionally toward their father, who did not look up from whatever middle distance he seemed permanently fixed upon. Nobody spoke of the woman who should have been standing at that stove. Nobody needed to. Her absence filled the room more completely than her presence ever could have. Eleanor noticed the rocking chair again, the shawl by the door, a small stack of unopened letters on a shelf near the hearth, dust settling faintly along their upper edges, as though they had been sitting there for weeks, perhaps longer. She said nothing about any of it, not that first night. Some things, she had learned, are not fixed by pointing at them. They are fixed slowly, quietly, by hands willing to do the work nobody asked for. The following morning, before the household woke, Eleanor rose in the gray light before dawn and did what she had come to do. She lit the stove. She found the flour, the lard, the last of the previous week's eggs, and began preparing a breakfast heartier than the thin fare she'd watched Thomas serve the night before. She noticed the woodpile beside the stove was nearly empty and made a note to ask about the axe. She noticed the water pail had a slow leak near its base, mended once, poorly, and left to fail again. She noticed a mending basket in the corner, untouched, containing at least 4 garments any competent hand could repair in an afternoon. She did not mention any of it. She simply began. By the time Thomas came in from the barn, the kitchen smelled of biscuits and coffee. The table was set, and Mary was seated on a stool near the stove, watching Eleanor work with the cautious fascination of a child observing something unfamiliar. Thomas stopped in the doorway. For a moment he said nothing. His eyes moved across the table. The food, his daughter, sitting closer to another human being than she had in months. Something flickered across his face. Not quite surprise. Not quite gratitude. Something more careful than either. "Didn't expect this," he said finally. Eleanor didn't look up from the stove. "You hired a housekeeper." "I hired someone to keep the children fed and the house standing. Then I'm doing my job." He studied her a long moment. Then, without another word, he sat down at the table. It wasn't much. But it was the first time in nearly a year that Thomas Calloway had eaten a meal sitting down. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them announced or discussed. Eleanor rose early. She managed the house quietly, efficiently, without asking permission for tasks that clearly needed doing. She mended the girl's blue dress one evening after the children had gone to bed, sitting alone by lamplight, drawing the needle through the hem with the same careful patience she brought to everything. She said nothing about it the next morning. She simply hung it, freshly repaired, in Mary's closet, and let the girl discover it on her own. Mary wore it 3 days later. Thomas noticed. He said nothing either. But Eleanor caught him looking at his daughter across the breakfast table that morning with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Something between relief and pain. The particular ache of watching a wound begin, almost imperceptibly, to close. She fixed the water pail without being asked, borrowing solder from a neighboring farm, and repairing the seam herself while the children were at their lessons. She pulled the first of the garden weeds one afternoon, not clearing the whole plot. That would come later and slowly, but enough to reveal, underneath the neglect, the careful rows someone had once planted with intention. Somebody knew what they were doing here, she said one evening, nodding toward the garden through the window. Thomas didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone quieter than usual. She did. That was all. 2 words. But it was the first time he had acknowledged his wife's existence out loud since Eleanor's arrival, and both of them seemed to understand the weight of that small admission. Eleanor didn't push further. She had learned, in her own life, that grief opens on its own schedule, never on someone else's. It was Daniel who came around next, though he would never have called it that. He was a boy who spoke through his hands rather than his mouth. And one afternoon, Eleanor found a small carved bird sitting on the kitchen windowsill, wings half finished, unmistakably left there rather than simply forgotten. She said nothing about it either. She only set it on the shelf above the stove, where it would catch the morning light, and left it there for him to find. The next carving appeared a week later. A horse, rough but recognizable. Then a second bird, finished this time, wings fully spread. "You've got a steady hand," she told him one evening, turning the horse over in her palm. Daniel shrugged, the way boys do when a compliment lands somewhere they don't yet know how to hold. "Pa taught me. Before." "Before?" "Before Ma." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Eleanor set the horse back on the shelf beside the others and let the silence do the rest of the talking. One evening on the porch, coffee cooling between them, the sky beginning its slow slide from gold to gray, Thomas surprised her. "You've been here a month now. 5 weeks. Children like you. Children are easy to like when you actually see them." Something shifted in his jaw. "You saying I don't?" "I'm saying grief makes a man's eyes go somewhere else for a while. Doesn't mean the love left. Just means it's harder to find the road back to where it's needed." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, turning his cup slowly between his hands. "You ever have somebody tell you they know what's best for you?" he asked finally, his voice low, rough at the edges. Eleanor's hand found the locket at her throat before she realized she'd moved. "Once." "What did you do?" "I let him decide for a while." Turned out he was deciding what was best for him, not me. Thomas huffed something that wasn't quite a laugh. "Family's supposed to be different. Sometimes it is. And sometimes—" Eleanor looked out at the dark shape of the ridge against the stars. "Sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who can talk us into believing we're not enough." Thomas went very still beside her. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind moved through the yard. Somewhere behind the house, an owl called once and fell silent. He opened his mouth as if to speak. Eleanor turned toward him slightly, waiting. Whatever it was, it sat right there at the edge of him, closer to the surface than it had been in over a year. Then he closed his mouth again, shook his head slightly. "Getting late?" he said instead, rising from the step. "Should turn in." Eleanor watched him go. Some doors, once shut, take longer to open than others. She had learned that lesson herself, the hard way. She was not about to force his. She did not know, that night, about the letter already sitting on a shelf 2 counties away, sealed and waiting to be posted. She did not know it would not be the last. Margaret Whitfield lived 2 counties away, in a house considerably finer than the Calloway ranch, married to a man of some standing, her own children well cared for and well dressed. She was Sister Thomas's late wife, and the only remaining family the children had beyond their father. She had written to Thomas twice in the past year. Both letters had gone unanswered, not out of malice. Thomas simply hadn't found the words. Margaret interpreted the silence differently, as neglect, as evidence of exactly what she'd feared since her sister's funeral, that a grieving man, alone on an isolated ranch, was no fit guardian for two young children who deserved, in her words, stability, structure, and a mother's steady hand. She had heard, through a mutual acquaintance in town, that Thomas had hired a young unmarried woman to keep his house. The information troubled her more than it should have, not because it was improper, because it meant someone else was now doing the work Margaret believed rightfully belonged to family. Her sister's children. The letter that arrived at the Calloway ranch 4 days later carried no threat, no accusation, nothing a court could ever call cruelty. It carried something far more difficult to fight. Concern, sincere, loving, utterly convinced concern, the kind that believes itself to be rescue, the kind that rarely backs down. You need only say the word Thomas, and we would welcome Daniel and Mary with open arms. For as long as you needed, no one would think less of you for it. Grief asks more of man than anyone should ever give alone. Thomas read it once. Then again, his jaw tightened somewhere in the second reading, though his expression otherwise gave nothing away. He thought of the rocking chair by the window. He thought of the mending basket that had sat untouched for months before Eleanor arrived. He thought of his daughter, humming quietly while someone else braided her hair, because he hadn't known how, and had never once tried to learn. For the briefest moment, something in him wondered if Margaret was right, if perhaps he wasn't enough, if perhaps he never had been, since the day the ground closed over his wife's grave, and something in him had closed along with it. The thought frightened him more than he expected, enough that he folded the letter, set it on the shelf beside the others, and did not answer it. Not that night, not the next morning either. But letters, like grief, do not remain silent simply because they go unanswered. Within the week, a second letter arrived, less patient than the first, hinting, gently but unmistakably, that if Thomas could not offer a satisfactory answer soon, Margaret intended to visit in person to see the children's situation for herself. Eleanor didn't know any of it yet. All she knew was that something in Thomas had grown heavier in recent days, a stillness that sat differently on him than his usual quiet, the way a held breath differs from an easy one. The visit came on a gray March evening, colder than expected, the kind of cold that settles into a house before anyone thinks to light the lamps. Margaret's second letter had finally forced Thomas's hand, not toward her, but toward the truth he'd been carrying since the funeral. That night, after the children were asleep, Eleanor found him on the porch again, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. She almost turned back inside. Something about his stillness told her this was not a moment meant to be witnessed, but something else, some instinct she didn't examine too closely, made her stay instead. "Can't sleep?" she asked quietly, settling onto the step beside him, careful to leave space between them. He didn't answer right away. "Something on your mind?" Still nothing. The wind moved through the yard, rattling the loose shutter on the north window he still hadn't fixed. And then, finally, his voice barely above a whisper, the words arriving the way a dam gives way, not all at once, but in one long, unstoppable rush. "My wife died in this house, in the front room. I was 30 feet away, and there wasn't a single thing I could do to stop it." Eleanor didn't move, didn't fill the silence. "I buried my wife last spring," he said. "And every day since, I've been standing in the same room she used to stand in, telling myself I was still living. I wasn't. I was just occupying the space where a life used to be." He looked down at his hands. "There's a woman 2 counties away convinced I can't do right by my own children. And some nights I look around this house and I think, maybe she's not wrong. Maybe I've just been standing here, keeping the fences mended and the herd fed, and calling that enough when it never was." Eleanor let the silence sit for a moment before she spoke, her own voice steadier than she felt. "You want to know what I've noticed since I came here?" He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. I've noticed a boy who leaves carvings on windowsills because he doesn't know how to say what he means any other way. I've noticed a girl who wore a mended dress for the first time in months and looked, for one whole afternoon, like a child instead of someone waiting for something bad to happen again. And I've noticed a man who never once let his fences fall, or his herd go hungry, or his children go without, even while he was convinced he had nothing left to give them. She turned toward him fully now. That's not a man who isn't enough, Thomas. That's a man who's been enough this whole time and never once believed it. Thomas didn't answer with words. He nodded once, and something in his shoulders, carried for a year like a weight he'd stopped noticing was there, eased just slightly for the first time since the funeral. "Then let me be your family now," Eleanor said. Not a proposal, not a rescue, just an offer, plain and unshaking, from a woman who understood exactly what it cost to say out loud, and exactly what would mean to mean it. Margaret arrived in person less than 2 weeks later, and what she found unsettled her more than any letter could have prepared her for, a household that was unmistakably healing, children who laughed, a man who met her eyes without flinching, a woman she couldn't quite categorize, not a wife, not merely staff, something in between that Margaret didn't have a word for and didn't entirely trust. Convinced, out of love rather than malice, that this arrangement was too fragile to protect her sister's children, Margaret filed a petition for custody. The hearing was held the second Monday of June, in a courthouse 2 hours from Cedar Hollow, filled well before the appointed hour. News, as it always did in a territory this small, had traveled faster than anyone would have preferred. Margaret's testimony was exactly what Eleanor expected. Sincere, measured, devastatingly reasonable. "I do not believe Thomas is a bad father," she said, her eyes finding his with something like real affection beneath the formality. "But grief is a heavy thing, Your Honor, and I have watched from a distance as this family struggled beneath its weight for over a year." Her gaze moved to Eleanor. "She is, by her own admission, an unmarried woman with no legal relationship to this family, employed for a matter of months, with no guarantee of permanence. I simply ask the court to consider what happens to Daniel and Mary if that arrangement does not last." It was, Eleanor thought, sitting rigid in her seat, an almost unanswerable argument, not because it was cruel, because it was true. Thomas's testimony followed, halting at first, the words of a man unaccustomed to speaking about his own grief in front of strangers. "I won't stand here and tell you I haven't struggled," he said, his voice steady despite the difficulty of the admission. "I have, more than I ever let anyone see. But I have never once stopped loving my children or trying every single day to give them the best life I know how to build." He looked toward Eleanor. "And these past few months, with Miss Hayes and our household, I have watched my children come back to life in ways I didn't know how to give them myself. Not because she replaced anything, because she made room for what was already there, buried under grief I didn't know how to move past alone." It was Eleanor's testimony the room remembered longest. She rose when called, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled only slightly, and faced the judge directly. "Your Honor, I understand concerns raised here today. I understand them because I share some of them myself. I am not a blood relative of these children. I have no legal claim to their care. 3 months ago, I was a stranger arriving at that ranch with nothing more than a letter of introduction and a need for steady work." She glanced briefly toward Mary, seated just behind Thomas, small hands folded tightly in her lap. "But I did not come here today to argue that I have any right to replace what these children lost. Nothing could replace that, and nothing should try." Her voice steadied, gathering the quiet certainty that carried her through every mended dress, every early morning, every small, unremarkable act of care that had, together, built into something undeniable. "I came here to say that I have watched 2 children slowly remember how to laugh again. I have watched a father find his way back to his own family after a year of simply surviving beside them. And I have made a choice of my own free will to stay and be part of whatever comes next for this family. Not because anyone asked me to, and not because it is convenient, but because somewhere in these past 3 months, this stopped being a household I was employed to manage and became a family I chose." She let the words settle before delivering the line that would, by the following week, be repeated in kitchens and church pews across the entire county. "I didn't come here to replace anyone. I came here to make sure no child in that house ever has to wonder if they're loved. That's not a replacement. That's a promise." The room was utterly silent. It was Mary, called forward gently by the judge and asked whether she felt safe and cared for home, who delivered the testimony no legal argument could have matched. She stood small and solemn before the bench, hands clasped in front of her. "I feel safe," she said simply. Papa laughs again. "And Eleanor braids my hair every morning, even when I don't ask her to, because she says that's just what family does." She looked then, not at the judge, but across the room toward Margaret, her aunt's carefully composed face softening visibly. "I love you too, Aunt Margaret, but I don't want to leave home. This is home. Eleanor makes it feel like home again." Margaret did not need the judge to rule before she understood, watching her niece's small, unguarded face, that she had already lost the argument she came to make, not because her concerns had been unreasonable, not because her love for the children was in question, but because sitting in that courtroom, watching Mary's simple certainty, watching Thomas's transformed presence, watching Eleanor's steady conviction, Margaret recognized something she had been too far away to see clearly until now. This was not a household failing to cope with grief. This was a household that had found its way through it. The judge, after a brief recess, denied the petition within the hour. The children would remain with their father. But it was what happened afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, that the county would remember longest. Margaret approached Thomas and Eleanor slowly, her composure finally breaking, tears standing openly in her eyes. "I only wanted them safe," she said quietly. "I only wanted them loved." "I know," Thomas said and meant it. Margaret turned to Eleanor, studying her for a long moment. "I was wrong about you. I thought you were a stranger playing at something that wasn't yours to claim. I see now I was looking at the wrong thing entirely." She extended her hand, and Eleanor took it. "Thank you," Margaret said simply, "for loving them when I was too far away to—" It was not friendship. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something neither woman could have predicted 3 months earlier, an antagonist, softened not by defeat, but by understanding, by autumn. The rocking chair by the window had a new occupant most evenings, Mary, curled against Eleanor's side, while she read aloud, the same way Thomas once stood unseen in a hallway, listening to a voice reading his daughter back to life. The shawl by the door had finally come down, folded and put away, not forgotten, simply no longer needed to hold a space open for someone who had already, gently, been given her rest. Daniel's carvings had multiplied along the kitchen windowsill until Eleanor built him a proper shelf for them, and he'd stood in front of it for a long moment, quiet in the way he always was, before saying only, "Looks good there." It was, from Daniel, the same as a speech. Thomas married Eleanor the following spring, exactly 1 year after he'd first whispered 5 words he'd never said aloud to anyone. Margaret stood among the small gathering of guests, no longer an outsider to it, dabbing at her eyes and insisting unconvincingly that it was only the dust. Grief, Thomas had learned, does not leave a house simply because someone tells it to, but it can be joined by something stronger, patient enough to sit beside it, evening after evening, until the silence it once demanded finally learns to hold laughter instead. And on Widow's Rise, where a house had once stopped breathing, the lamp still burned every evening long after supper, not out of grief this time, but simply because a family that had finally found its way back to itself saw no reason to let the light go out early anymore.